Can you imagine walking out onto the pitch and seeing this formation or this other one that we could call 2-2-6? Believe it or not, that's how football was not so long ago, and it became incredibly boring. The offside rule had to appear to save this sport. However, now it represents more of a problem. Matches don't flow, there are goals that are canceled by millimeters, and any celebration is halted halfway. To discover how we got to the situation and why it's almost certain to change in the near future, we must understand what happened over time. There were particularly 6 key moments that led to today. The first of them occurred in 1863. Back then, teams were set up like this, and it looked more like a rugby match than football. The reason was the first version of the offside rule. It stated that players couldn't pass to a teammate who was ahead of the ball line. Yes, you heard that right. Just like how it works in the sport with the oval ball. Unlike rugby, this created a dynamic where passing almost never happened. What tended to happen was that a player would take it and basically want to dribble past everything in their way. If they saw they weren't going to make it, they'd just kick it forward, hoping a teammate coming from behind would take it and continue the play. For that reason, it was common to see lines of up to 8 forwards, something we're sure many have tried in FIFA or PES when players could be moved freely. Ironically, even with so many forwards, football was going through a terrible goal drought, and with it, a lack of excitement. In fact, the first official match in history between Barnes and Richmond ended 0-0. This is our first example of something that will appear throughout the video. Teams building entire strategies to adapt to the rules. If we move forward just 3 years to 1866, we'll leave behind the tedious era of rugby football and enter our second phase. This is where one of the big changes happened. Moving on to what is known as the rule of 3 opponents. It stated that a player would be offside if there were fewer than 3 opponents between him and the opposing goal, which is understood in practice as the goalkeeper and 2 defenders. The change was drastic. Suddenly, attackers could position themselves ahead of the teammate with the ball. For coaches, it meant one thing. Now, passing made sense, which is why the midfield became especially important in the game. At the end of the day, that's the place that gets the team flowing. So, the old 2-2-6 formation was replaced by this sort of inverted pyramid. If we start from the previous setup, what happened was that one forward dropped back to midfield. This extra player had an all-around role: assist, score, and even defend when necessary. That's how a role was born that decades later would make people like Steven Gerrard or Yaya Toure shine. However, as time went on, the teams adjusted and a new issue emerged: the rigidity and predictability of the system. Except for the midfield, the rest of the team tended to stay quite fixed in their positions. The 5 attackers waited for the ball to score, while the 2 defenders were like immovable towers. There weren't any big surprises. This guy had to come and fix it. We're talking about Jimmy Hogan, who was nicknamed the Pep Guardiola of his time. True to his nickname, he proposed something which now might sound simple, but was revolutionary back then: making forwards take on roles other than just scoring goals. Now, not only would the midfielders be flexible, but the attackers also needed to fall back if necessary. The aim of this strategy was to make the opponents leave their natural area, a concept later defined as dragging the marker, which involves creating spaces and providing more options when attacking. Going back to Hogan, with his correction, the offense improved considerably, and the matches gained a lot of dynamism, something that, as we know, is more than welcome by the viewers. Unfortunately, the opponents once again found a way to counteract it. They did it with none other than the famous offside trap. Under the 3-opponent rule, this consisted of something very basic. One of the defenders from the back had to quickly move forward so that the attacker would be automatically offside. Unlike how it works today, if this went wrong and the forward remained onside, there was still another defender to stop them. Here we see, once again, what we said a few moments ago. For every new regulation, teams develop strategies around them to make the most out of them. So it's not just about figuring out how to solve the problem at hand, but also trying to anticipate what other issues might arise in the next scenario. If there was a team that knew how to exploit the offside trap to the fullest, it was Newcastle United. They were experts at catching opposing attackers offside. In February 1925, the Magpies recorded their 6th goalless draw of the season, thanks to repeatedly applying this strategy. We assume you've already figured out what the problem is. The matches lost their essence, turning into something totally fragmented and full of interruptions. The average goal in England at that time was just 2.58. Football had become boring, and the situation was unsustainable. So, in that same year, 1925, the English Football Association, the most important football institution in those years, proposed choosing between 2 alternatives, and thus we come to our third key moment. The first one was about reducing the number of opponents needed for a player to be onside from 3 to 2. In practice, it would involve the goalkeeper and 1 defender. This would benefit the forwards, who could attack with more space and closer to the opponent's goal. Also, this change would mean that implementing the offside trap would no longer be so easy. If it failed, the center forward would be left alone with the goalkeeper. The second option considered by the Football Association was to create a line 36 meters from each goal, beyond which any player would be offside. With this proposal, it no longer depended on the number of players, just whether they crossed the line or not. Here, the issue was that the attack was very limited to those 36 meters. So, after testing both alternatives in trial matches, the Football Association ended up opting for the first one. The new proposal was implemented from the 2025 to 2026 season in the English tournament and had an immediate impact on the show. In the previous year's competition, the last under the old rule, 4,700 goals had been scored in 1,848 matches. In the next edition, however, the number jumped to 6,373, with no change in the number of matches. We're talking about more than 1,600 goals of difference. Absolutely mad. The show was back, and the ball was smiling again. Unfortunately, just like with the rule of 3 opponents, it was expected that coaches would adjust and rearrange the defense based on this new regulation. In that sense, one of the most influential was Herbert Chapman, in charge of Arsenal. With the attackers taking advantage of the spaces and being left alone in front of the goalkeeper, the line of 2 defenders was very poor. So, Chapman revamped the old inverted pyramid to turn it into a shape called WM. What he proposed was that a midfielder drop back to defense, and to maintain creativity in the middle, 2 forwards would drop to the center. That adaptation turned out to be very advantageous, but it was still quite risky. That's why, afterwards, the choice was made to add another central midfielder, creating a final line of 4 players. This is how the 4-2-4 was born, one of the most influential systems in history. The lineup offered an almost perfect balance. While the 4 at the front were enough to unsettle the opponent, the 4 at the back recovered the ball, and the 2 in the middle supported both the attack and defense. With the benefit of hindsight, we know this was almost perfect because, as you will see, there were 2 large areas completely unprotected. And if there was a team capable of solving it, it was the Brazilian national team. The Carioca team, inspired by the flexibility of Jimmy Hogan, incorporated many more rotations and even asymmetric positions to cover those vulnerable areas. More importantly, they created enormous unpredictability in the attack. A forward could move back to drag their marker, while the midfielder took advantage of the space to surprise the opponent. Or the number 9 could head out to the wings and be a midfielder waiting in the area for a high ball. All these plays might seem obvious today, but it was a revolution back then. With great figures like Pelé, Garrincha, Jairzinho, and Carlos Alberto, the Verde Amarela won no less than 3 World Cups between 1950 and 1970. They were simply indecipherable. In terms of sports, everything seemed to be working. The entertainment was better, broadcasts were already in color, and the offside rule was appropriate. Football was shining. But not everything could be that good. The truth is, not every team was capable of executing such a complex game with such coordinated movements. They didn't have the time, the training, or the players necessary to do it. That's why they started looking for simpler yet effective alternatives. One of them was the historic Swiss team, Servette, which is currently in the first division. Their coach, Karl Rappen, understood that the best way to compete against the offensive power of the Giants was to focus exclusively on the art of defending, not on trying to replicate the beautiful play of the Brazilians. To achieve this, he took the 4-2-4 formation we just mentioned and made 2 changes. The first was to bring one of the forwards to the middle for better containment. The second, even more important, was to position a player behind the defensive line. The unusual formation ended up being a 1-3-3-3. Yes, just like it sounds. 1-3-3-3. The secret of the strategy lay in that last football player. Karl called him the backup defender. His only role was to cover the gap when another defender went too far, either to chase a player or try to recover the ball. Even though it might seem like a somewhat strange tactic, it achieved incredible results, to the point that it led him to coach the national team, where he would replicate that strategy. And, as we know, when something works, others quickly copy it. In this case, it was Italy that adopted and even evolved the model, creating one that would later be known as catenaccio, which means lock. Here, the spare player would come to be known as a libero or sweeper. This not only occupied the open spaces, but also initiated counterattacks with long passes. The Italians didn't just stick to the 1-3-3-3, but also evolved into other formations like this. Now they had 5 players at the back, something ideal to counter the 4-2-4 that was still predominant in football. The outcome was an amazingly compact team within 25 meters of the playing field. As Johan Cruyff himself used to say, defending is simply minimizing the space you have to cover. Over time, coaches further perfected the art of the offside trap. Back then, the key was that the attacker had to be completely behind the opponent. If they were on the same line, it would be offside. That's why the defender just needed a way to take a small step forward and thus nullify the opponent. The defender had the advantage. Even if he couldn't disable him, he would then have some distance in chasing the ball. For the fans, once again, the match was completely ruined. So many interruptions and few goals. Just like before 1925, football was in danger again. Because deep down, if something isn't entertaining, it doesn't sell. And if something doesn't sell, the club doesn't grow and the sport doesn't continue its development. Luckily, the 1990 World Cup in Italy would come, our 4th stop. Despite having some notable moments, like England's 3-2 against Cameroon, not even the iconic anthem Unstate Italiana saved it from being labeled as one of the poorest in terms of spectacle. The average goals per match were just 2.21, the lowest figure in the history of the World Cup up to that moment. It was unbearable. So, on June 28th of that year, right in the midst of the World Cup dispute, the International Football Association Board changed the offside rule to practically how we know it today. Starting from the next season, a player would be onside as long as they're in line with the second-to-last opponent when the pass is made. That means it was no longer necessary to be completely behind them. This clearly favored the attack. Now, the forward had the advantage of momentum when going to catch the pass. Plus, once again, the offside trap became more difficult to execute. Precision had to be absolute. Now with the new rules, the next World Cup, United States 1994 had an average of 2.71 goals per game, greatly improving the record compared to Italy. The decision had been a good one. Tactically, the catenaccio with a sweeper at the back became really tough to implement. Because of the advantage the forwards would now have, leaving just one player in front of the goalkeeper without anyone on the sides to provide support was an impossible mission. It would be one-on-one in nearly every play. That's when the coaches decided to eliminate the libero position and return to a line of 4 defenders. Also, it started to be discussed that it was more convenient to cover the midfield spaces rather than having so many attackers. This is how the 4-4-2 formation became consolidated, one of the most balanced and used formations today. Despite all the tactical adjustments to the new regulations, this time football didn't lose its essence. Teams continued to find gaps, thread passes between the lines, and turn those moves into goals. Since that moment, only minor tweaks have been made to refine the rule. Perhaps the most significant occurred in the year 2005, the 5th chapter of our journey. Here, 2 fundamental clarifications were added. Firstly, it was determined that a player is only offside if a part with which they can play the ball is ahead of the last defender. That means if the arm crosses the line, it doesn't count and remains allowed, something that further favored the attack. The second point was about clarifying what it means to interfere in the play, and therefore be considered for the offside position. From here on, not only touching the ball offside is penalized, but also directly or indirectly intervening in the situation. That is to say, bothering, blocking the goalkeeper's view, or even dragging the mark are actions that are also penalized for offside. This rule does work in favor of the defense, doing justice to everything a defender must consider when performing their duty. Thanks to this journey, we witnessed great styles of play, like Barcelona's tiki-taka and Real Madrid's counterattacks. However, delving deeper into when a player is offside and when not brought a new problem: human error. Unlike other sports like tennis or rugby, where technology already assisted referees, in football, everything still depended on the perception of a person running alongside the defenders. And like any individual, whether well-intentioned or not, they could make mistakes. And, oh yes, we had our fair share of disasters. We probably all remember one game or another where our team was incredibly disadvantaged. It was only a matter of time before greater accuracy was sought through technology. That solution, as we know, was VAR. This is our last stop on the journey, the era of the video assistant referee. First implemented in Major League Soccer in 2017, and then making its debut in the World Cup in Russia 2018, VAR became a reality. In the beginning, it involved manually drawing lines over the broadcast image. This system is believed to have cost approximately $7,500 per match, a figure more than justifiable given the minimal margin of error it promised. However, while it brought some fairness, it also came with an incredible amount of lost time. Pierluigi Collina, president of the FIFA Referees Committee, said the following: "Nowadays, the tools for drawing offside lines, like triangulation, take time to find the exact point of the kickoff and also the position of the players. On average, it takes about 70 seconds to check the offside. The reality is that he was quite generous with that average. In the real world, we had several cases where that number was far exceeded. In the Champions League match between Manchester City and Real Madrid, in February 2025, for example, almost 4 minutes were lost. In last season's Premier League, fans of Nottingham Forest and West Ham had to wait more than 6 minutes to find out the decision. In the FA Cup, it was even worse. They wasted 10 minutes of the match between Bournemouth and Wolves, which meant the excitement generated by the ball was once again affected. This time, not for something tactical, but rather operational. Looking for a solution, in the year 2022, the development of the semi-automatic offside system was promoted. It's believed that this would cost $20,000 per match. This software has special cameras and sensors in the ball that allow the information to be captured considerably faster. Thanks to this, it calculates in milliseconds the position of each body in relation to the ball and the last defender. Consequently, the validation process became much quicker. Again, Pierluigi Collina himself explained that offside decisions should only take longer than the average of 25 seconds if they involve multiple offside elements, or if there is a more complicated subjective aspect, like whether the attacking player interferes with the game or not. With this technology, the precision reached an unprecedented level, to the point where we started seeing offsides by literally wearing one size bigger shoes. For both commentators and fans, shouting a goal is just not the same anymore. Now, we have to wait for confirmation. According to a study by Sporting News, which compared different leagues before and after VAR, the number of goals decreased again. The most noticeable case was in the Spanish league, where it dropped from 1,061 goals to 559. And if we only analyze set pieces, the decrease was even more marked, from 981 to 838 goals. And although most of those goals were correctly disallowed, it doesn't change the slight decline in goals. And we know that in the long run, this makes matches less attractive for the spectators. We're still incredibly early to say there's a new crisis, but certainly alternatives are already being considered. Arsene Wenger himself, now director of development at FIFA, suggests that for an offside position to be considered, the entire body of the attacker must completely surpass the last defender, and not just a part. If we think about it for a second, the rule is the same as the one from 1925, but reversed. At that time, for the attacker to be onside, their entire body had to be behind the defender. Now the logic has flipped. The player would only be offside if their whole body is ahead. If any part that can play the ball is on the same line, then they're onside. According to the former Arsenal coach, this would again favor the attack. Forwards would have more opportunities, and football would regain its essence. The proposal is already being tested in several youth categories. If they have the expected effect there, then it's only a matter of time before the big teams adopt them. Perhaps the most interesting question is, if every time the rules were changed, coaches designed schemes to defend better, what lineups could emerge under these new regulations? Because if there's one thing that's clear, it's that the rules aim to favor the show, and therefore, the goals. But at the same time, teams manage to decode them, and sooner or later, they lose their charm. What do you all think? Is there a definitive rule, or will it always be a matter of change and adaptation? We're interested in reading your comments, but before you go, make sure you're subscribed to the channel. See you next time.